Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. As many of you know, the mission of the Future of Freedom Foundation is to present an uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. And as part of that philosophy, we have long taken, actually since our inception some 27 years ago, we have long taken an ardent, firm stance against the federal program known as the War on Drugs. This interview discussion session is with Paul Armentano and is part of a series to show why the drug war should be ended now. Paul, welcome. Nice to have you here. And would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me, Jacob. I've long respected the work that the Future of Freedom Foundation does on the drug war issue and on a number of other issues. I'm the Deputy Director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, which is a national advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., that lobbies for the repeal of criminal and civil penalties regarding the responsible adult use of marijuana. We would like to see those penalties repealed, and we would also like to see the establishment of an above-ground regulated market so that the commercial enterprises with regard to the production and retail sale of cannabis are also safe and legal.
All right, your organization is known by the acronym NORMAL. I know it's been around a long time. Exactly how long has NORMAL been around?
NORMAL was founded in late 1970.
All right, now you know the standard arguments, I'm sure. How long have you been with NORMAL?
I've been with NORMAL on two different occasions. I first became a part of this organization in the mid-1990s. I then left for a handful of years and returned about 15 years ago, and I've been with the organization ever since.
All right, well, you know, you're familiar with the standard argument that we've gotten over the years from regular people that are just concerned about drug usage in America, especially among young people, people that have children. And when they first hear the idea of legalizing marijuana, they're just shocked. They're stunned because, I mean, everything they want to be teaching their kids is that this is something not healthy. This is not an avenue they wish to pursue. So what is your argument as to why marijuana law should be abolished?
Well, a good part of this argument is the simple fact that you and I in 2016 are having this conversation today. The reality is states first began criminalizing marijuana beginning with Massachusetts in 1911. The federal government got involved in the marijuana prohibition business with the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937. Self-evidently, if criminalization was a successful policy, was a policy that could succeed in its stated goals, which are to reduce the use of marijuana and to eliminate the public's access to marijuana, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. But self-evidently, those policies have not worked. Tens of millions of Americans today use cannabis. Children have ready access to cannabis. So clearly, self-evidently, we need as a society to pursue alternative policies. And the general public understands this. According to polling data that just came out last week by the Pew Research Center, 57% of voters now say that marijuana ought to be legal for responsible adults and that its commercial sales ought to be regulated. Only about 1/3 of the public supports the continued prohibition of marijuana. So NORMAL believes, like a majority of the public, that while the use of cannabis or the misuse of marijuana may be a public health concern, and in some cases a legitimate public health concern, it ought not to be a criminal justice issue. We as a society are in a much better place to address the use and potential abuse of cannabis in an environment where such use is above ground, licensed, and legally regulated than in an environment where all transactions are left to the devices of the underground criminal black market.
Yeah, we've really seen a sea change in public opinion. I guess you've seen in the last 15 years on this issue, right?
It's actually been a fairly seismic shift in public opinion. Again, if we just look at the Pew data that is most recent, we see over the last decade there has almost been a flip-flopping of the numbers. If we go back to 2006, only 32% of the American public said they supported legalization. 60% said they did not. Today, those numbers stand at 57% in favor and 36% against. When we look at the Gallup polling, which is polled on this issue every year since 1969, we find 58% of the public supports legalization. Again, a dramatic shift just in the last 10, 15 years.
Well, you know that there's two basic arguments for ending the war on drugs. One is the freedom argument or the moral argument. You have a right to ingest whatever you want without being put in jail for it. And then the other one is all of the destructive aspects of the war on drugs. Do you have any feel at all as to what has caused this seismic shift in public opinion?
You know, believe it or not, I would argue that the internet has played a huge role in shifting public opinion when it comes to marijuana. For decades, the largest, in some cases the only mouthpiece that was out there with regard to information about marijuana and marijuana policy came from the federal government. And obviously, it was a very biased source of information. With the advent of the internet, the general public had the ability, in some cases for the first time, to access scientific information about cannabis and do it privately in their homes, do it anonymously. And I think that began this sea change in public opinion. The public simply did not have access to accurate information about marijuana and marijuana policy. Over the last 15 and 20 years, they've begun to be able to access that information. And having that access has shifted public opinion. The other change we've seen is that this concept of legalization has gone from theoretical to pragmatic. No longer do we have to have a discussion where we talk about what may occur in an environment where cannabis is legal. Now we can point to jurisdictions in the United States like Colorado, like Oregon, like Washington, and say, this is what happens when a society legalizes and regulates the use of marijuana for adults. And the reality is, the sky doesn't fall, tax revenues increase, and public safety gets stronger. And the American public can see that with their own eyes. They don't have to travel halfway across the world to experience what that sort of freedom looks like. And not surprisingly, momentum continues to build.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about these states that have legalized marijuana. What have you seen in terms of changes with respect to violence in these states? Have you noticed anything different as compared to the states that still have drug laws?
So there's a number of interesting papers that have come out over the last few years assessing whether the legalization of marijuana could in fact be an independent variable in any number of different social welfare outcomes. The strongest data that we have now from multiple scientific studies is that in jurisdictions where adults have legal above-ground access to marijuana, the use of opioid-based drugs falls dramatically. And in fact, many of the inadvertent effects of the use and abuse of opioids falls dramatically in those jurisdictions. So for instance, we see a less abuse of opioids, we see a lower rates of opioid-based mortality in states where there is access to marijuana. We've seen other studies that show some reduction in violent crime rates, some reduction in alcohol-induced accidents on the road. There appears to be some level of substitution effect that takes place when jurisdictions legalize marijuana. The public doesn't use opioids to the degree they otherwise would, and they tend not to use alcohol to the same degree they otherwise would.
Now, what are opioids?
We're talking about pain prescription drugs, opiates, drugs like fentanyl, morphine, oxycodone.
And so you're saying that when marijuana is illegal, people tend to use those drugs more than they would marijuana?
What we see is in states where marijuana is legal, where the public has access to marijuana, that there is lower use of opiates in those jurisdictions compared to jurisdictions where the public does not have legal access to opiates.
Yeah,
and that's a finding that has been found consistently now. The RAND Corporation did a study looking at that issue. The University of Pennsylvania did a study that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association looking at that particular issue. And most recently, the University of Georgia published a study that found that the number of prescriptions that were filed for conventional drugs under Medicare Part D was significantly lower in states where there was access to marijuana as opposed to states where there was not.
Oh, that's very interesting. All right, explain to me the difference between the competition that exists between marijuana suppliers in Colorado and Oregon versus the marijuana suppliers, say, in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, or any states that here in the United States, the inner cities.
Sure. Well, under the state laws in now 4 jurisdictions, Alaska, Oregon, Colorado, and Washington, the commercial production and retail sale of cannabis is legal under a state license. So in those jurisdictions, entities that operate in that market are licensed by their respective states to engage in that behavior. There are regulations that govern how marijuana is produced, how it is packaged, how it is labeled, to some degree the quantities for which it may be sold to someone who is over the age of 21. And of course, in all other jurisdictions, those same activities take place every day, but there are no regulations governing those activities. There is no quality control or safety controls in place governing the actual product. There is obviously no revenue that is gained through the taxation of those transactions. So we would argue that since this activity is taking place anyway, we might as well accept that reality, acknowledge that reality, and bring that activity above board.
Yeah, my understanding has always been, I don't know if this applies to marijuana, and you can tell me if it does or doesn't, but that most people who die of so-called drug overdoses, like heroin being the major example, that they're not really overdosing at all. They're buying a corrupted mixture of a drug that they have purchased on the black market. And that in a legalized market, you don't have that problem because you've got pharmacies and reputable companies that depend on the quality of their product. They don't want people dying from it, while a drug gang couldn't care less whether somebody overdosed or died from their product. Does that same principle hold with marijuana?
Sure. The argument is we would rather have the production and sale of marijuana in the hands of licensed businesses that are governed by particular regulations and out of the hands of criminal entrepreneurs. And that's what these jurisdictions have done. Now, marijuana is not capable of causing lethal overdose, but certainly there can be issues with the quality of the product. It could contain mold, it could be grown with pesticides, there could be production issues that pose particular risks to the general public. And again, in these particular jurisdictions, there are regulations that that address these particular issues. There are quality controls in place to assure that the public has a safe product and a product that is properly labeled and packaged.
Okay, now in these states that have legalized marijuana, has this been done by the legislature or through initiative and referendum?
Well, in each of these cases, these policies came into play because a majority of voters went to the ballot box and voted in favor of specific initiatives. There is still not yet an example of a state legislatively making these sort of changes. And in fact, most recently, NORML released a congressional report card where we graded all 535 members of Congress. We assigned them a letter grade A through F based on either their public statements, bills they've co-sponsored, or marijuana-specific votes they've made in Congress. And as you would suspect, there remains a significant chasm between public opinion on the issue of marijuana legalization and the opinion of the majority of federally elected officials. In fact, while, as I noted earlier, Gallup and Pew find that nearly 6 out of 10 American voters believe that marijuana should be legal, only 4% of members of Congress are on record taking a position in support of legalizing the adult use of marijuana. That was a total of 21 members of Congress supporting that position. So it is not surprising that we see that these changes at this time are largely instigated by voters. They're not coming from elected officials.
All right, well, you say not surprising. That shocks me. I don't understand why the elected representatives of the people are not reflecting this particular shift in public opinion. And you would think that since they have to run for office, that they're going to naturally reflect the views of their constituents. Do you have an explanation as to why this chasm exists?
That's really the million-dollar question. And we see this chasm growing even as we enter this coming election. There will be ballot initiatives, statewide ballot initiatives, specific to marijuana policy in 9 states on November 8th. That's nearly half of the states that allow for the ballot initiative process. And while on the one hand, this is representative of an maturing and an evolution in marijuana policy reform, it's also reflective of this growing divide between public opinion and legislative opinion. Because theoretically, if politicians were responding to the views of their constituency, we would not be needing to put this issue to a direct vote in 9 states. The legislatures in those states and in other states would be addressing this issue, but they are still entirely reluctant to even begin to address this issue. At the federal level, for instance, despite the fact that now 26 states have legalized the medical use of marijuana, there is yet to have been a single hearing on the issue at the federal level. After this election, it is possible that we might have 30 jurisdictions where medical marijuana is legal and 9 states where the adult use of marijuana is legal. It is very possible that that kind of outcome may begin to stimulate change at the federal level, perhaps at the legislative level at the state. But ultimately, politicians on this particular issue tend to be very risk averse. And when we look at the history of marijuana prohibition, we see that by and large, it did not begin with the federal government, it began with the states. The federal government eventually mimicked what the states had done. We believe that when cannabis is re-legalized, we're going to see this same historic pattern. The change begins with the states, and ultimately the federal government will have no choice but to follow. But please do not think that the federal government is leading on this issue. It is the voters, it is the constituents who are leading. They have no other choice but to.
Yeah, it's a fascinating phenomenon. I mean, you couldn't have a better example of a so-called grassroots movement. Tell me about the federal enforcement of marijuana laws in the states that one have legalized marijuana totally for recreational use, and then the other states where they've legalized it only for medicinal purposes.
Sure. So there are two pieces of federal legislation in play here. Uh, well, one actually is not federal legislation, but in 2014, the Obama administration issued a memo which it sent to all of US prosecutors. And this is known as the Cole memo. And it put forward guidelines for US prosecutors that essentially said, we, as the Obama administration, want you to take a largely hands-off approach in these jurisdictions that are regulating the use of marijuana, whether it's for medicinal use or whether it's for adult use, as long as those regulatory schemes comport with 8 federal priorities. And those priorities included things like making sure or taking steps to assure that marijuana does not leave that jurisdiction and go to another state that has not legalized marijuana. That the state regulations are making efforts to make sure that marijuana does not get in the hands of those under the age of 21. So essentially what the federal government said is, we're going to let this experiment play out in the states as long as the states are holding up their end of the deal, and they are making sure that individuals involved in this market are abiding by these 8 federal priorities. And by and large, the administration has stood by that. They have largely not taken, or they have not interfered in these particular state programs. Now, there is also federal legislation known as the Rohrbacher Far Amendment, because the sponsors are Dana Rohrbacher and Sam Farr, both representatives from California. This amendment says that the Department of Justice cannot spend any federal funds for the purpose of prosecuting individuals or entities that are compliant with the marijuana laws of their respective states. That was an amendment that was introduced in 2014. It was approved by a majority of Congress and signed into law, but because it is a budgetary amendment, it must be renewed every fiscal year, and it has been since 2014. So right now, that law remains in effect. That bars the federal government from spending money to prosecute individuals who are compliant with the laws of their states.
Yeah, far be it for me to ever want to see anybody put in jail for ingesting a substance that he chooses to ingest, but there's just something that makes me uneasy about the fact that the federal government enacts and enforces laws and targets the people in the states for the enforcement of those laws and exempts other people. Do you have a sense of that as well?
That's a great point to bring up. It certainly is discriminatory. And in fact, NORML was involved in a legal challenge a couple of years ago where we were in federal court and argued that, in fact, that it was unconstitutional for the federal government to continue to define marijuana as a Schedule I prohibited drug under federal law, when in fact they were recognizing that marijuana had legitimate medical value in these jurisdictions, to the point that they had enacted a law that said they would not interfere with those regulatory schemes. Unfortunately, the judge was not persuaded by that argument.
And that was just at the district court level and never went to the...
That was at the federal court level.
Yeah, but it never went to the Court of Appeals, I take it then.
No.
Yeah. All right, let's return to the point that you began with about the first marijuana law being enacted in the state of, I think, Massachusetts, you said, in
Correct.
the year 1911. Is that what
Correct.
you said? All right. Explain to us the situation prior to that time with respect to marijuana laws here in the United States.
So it's very interesting. Marijuana first became popularized in this culture in about 1860 by a physician named William O'Shaughnessy, who returned from some overseas travels and had brought back cannabis tincture. And that began its medicinal use in this country. Cannabis was stocked in pharmacies in this country in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And in fact, when some of the first federal anti-drug laws were passed, cannabis was explicitly exempt from those laws. Because at that time, the federal government recognized it had therapeutic value, and it also didn't see that this was much of an issue that was worth the federal government becoming involved in. Beginning in 1911, with Massachusetts, you have a handful of states begin enacting marijuana prohibition laws. California was the second state to do so in 1913. And by the time you get to 1937, when the federal government finally imposes the Marijuana Tax Act, you had a majority of the states at that time had passed their own state prohibitions. Now, many of these states did so for very different reasons. If you look at the history of marijuana prohibition, Massachusetts, for instance, when you look at the legislative history, acknowledged at that time that virtually nobody in that jurisdiction used marijuana. But they anticipated that down the road, people may begin to use marijuana because the federal government was going to pass restrictions, which they did in the Harrison Narcotics Act, on the prescribed use of other controlled substances. So Massachusetts lawmakers thought they were being preemptive in classifying marijuana as a criminal offense. California in 1913, when you look at their legislative history, addressed marijuana for entirely different reasons. The argument in California was that certain ethnic groups, specifically Sikhs, were using cannabis, and for some reason this was seen as problematic, and therefore the Board of Pharmacy in California lobbied for marijuana to be made illegal. When we look at the rationale that was used in many southwestern states at this time, they argued that this was a drug that was primarily associated with Hispanics and Mexican immigrants, and they stoked a lot of racial fear-mongering in order to justify prohibiting marijuana. When we look at the southeastern region of the United States, we see that these sort of racial flames were also instigated, but in that case, marijuana was primarily associated with use by African Americans, and that was used as a justification for its prohibition. So we saw a number of different arguments, all of which now in hindsight seem absurd on their face, but at that time, that is what was motivating the states to take these actions, and then ultimately the federal government followed suit in 1937, and then the federal government reinforced that prohibition in 1970 with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, and that is the act that criminalizes marijuana today at the federal level.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting that that the marijuana laws were coming into existence at the same time that the entire progressive movement was ushering in the whole welfare state, where government's going to serve as people's daddy and parent and take care of them. And here they are watching over their children by putting them in jail or sending them to their room for ingesting harmful substances.
Yes, and you have to keep in mind, this was not a controversial issue at the time. There was not a lot of debate when you look at the legislative testimony or history of this issue, even at the federal level. The public, the media, pretty much all just went along. It's amazing if you look at old archived articles from the New York Times, from scientific journals that make statements like the single use of marijuana causes insanity, and that insanity is only lifted by death. The public believed these statements to be true. And now, of course, in hindsight, we see the absurdity of them.
Yeah, it's all part of that deference to authority that trusts the government and whatever it does. Explain to me, in the final few minutes here, why it is that with prohibition, which concerned alcohol, that they needed a constitutional amendment to prohibit it. But on drugs, they don't need a constitutional amendment. It seems to me the principle should be the same.
It seems that way to a lot of people, and certainly you're not the first person to raise that question. And if I had a law degree, I could probably give you a more definitive answer. What's even more interesting is when you look at the history of marijuana prohibition, again, going back to the Marijuana Tax Act, uh, the actual initial federal prohibition did not outlaw the use or the possession of cannabis per se. What it criminalized was engaging in these activities without previously having purchased and paid a tax to the federal government to engage in these activities. And of course, because the federal government never accepted anybody's payment for the tax and never actually issued tax stamps, it would, of course, be impossible for one to have complied with the law. But post 1937, one would not be prosecuted by the federal government for using or possessing marijuana. They would be prosecuted for failure to have paid their marijuana tax and engaged in these activities. So there was a recognition at that time by federal lawmakers that they had lacked the authority to simply criminalize the use of this particular substance. Of course, by 1970, we have the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, which placed most controlled substances in one of 5 federal schedules, Schedules 1 through 5, with Schedule 1 being the most prohibitive. Marijuana was placed in Schedule 1. That's where all the federal prohibition now comes from. This notion that by the passage of this act, the federal government believed by where they placed a particular controlled substance, they could either regulate it accordingly or they could prohibit it accordingly. What is interesting is that alcohol and tobacco were never scheduled, and they were not scheduled in the Controlled Substances Act. That's by and large why we see, particularly for alcohol, a very state-specific patchwork system with regard to how different states regulate the production and use of alcohol. That's because it is not included in the Controlled Substances Act, and the federal government largely is leaving those regulations up to the states. They took a very different path when it came to most other controlled substances.
All right, well, we know about the enormously long jail sentences that people have received over the years for marijuana violations, both at a state level and a federal level. Is that still taking place at both levels? Are people still receiving high sentences for marijuana violations?
This is actually a very interesting point you raised, because in 2016, the way we as a society address marijuana use is largely now based on geography. The same activities that are licensed and regulated and sanctioned, for instance, in Colorado, could get somebody life in prison in Oklahoma if they engage in those same activities. So by and large, the enforcement of marijuana prohibition and the guidelines regarding the sentencing of those who violate criminal marijuana laws is based on state policies. Yes, we have federal prohibition. Yes, the federal government has a law enforcement arm. But by and large, the majority, in fact, somewhere around 98% of the 700,000 or so annual marijuana arrests that occur every year in this country, they occur at the state and local level. And the enforcement of marijuana laws and the sentencing associated with the violation of those laws vary widely from state to state. Even excluding the jurisdictions where certain policies with regard to marijuana are deemed legal. If we're just looking at the states that continue to prohibit all use of marijuana, we see a wide discrepancy with regard to what those penalties are. For instance, in the state of Florida, the possession of more than 20 grams of marijuana is considered a felony. You will do jail time in that state. You will have a criminal record. You will be barred from ever voting again. In Oklahoma, cultivating a single marijuana plant is punishable by life in prison under that state guidelines. In Arizona, possession of even 1 gram of marijuana is deemed a felony. By contrast, in Ohio, a person can possess 100 grams of marijuana. It's a $100 fine.
That's amazing. That is truly amazing. Well, hopefully that number of, I think you said 67% or 57% of the American people will keep going up, and we can get rid of these tyrannical and unevenly enforced laws. You've been listening to and watching Paul Armentano, who's with the National Association for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. It's been